Welcome to the HCI family of podcasts. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We share our own original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. Join us for practitioner-oriented content around all things leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with the HCI family of podcasts. Pam Cohen, welcome to the conversation today.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
It is a pleasure to be with you. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Chicago, where it is bright and sunny.
Good. It's bright and sunny here as well, south of Salt Lake City in Utah, though we just had snow again this past weekend. So even in May, we're getting snow, and I'm hoping that spring is here to stay. And I'm sure you get some of that mixed weather in Chicago as well.
All the time.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me. Today, we're going to be talking about measuring workforce sentiment from external sources and data sets to find patterns that impact business and reputation, which is really what your work is all about. As we get started, I wanted to share Pam's bio with everybody. Pam Cohen is Chief Product Officer of Analyne. Pam is a behavioral scientist with interests and experience and expertise in creating opportunities for social impact in corporations. She has a proven track record of driving transformative insights across diverse sectors using predictive analytics that link back to bottom line performance for organizations. With extensive experience spanning think tanks, leading consultancies, and corporate environments, her expertise is in qualitative research, survey methodologies, analytics, and predictive modeling. And I could go on with the bio, Pam. You've accomplished many wonderful things, but I'm going to pause there. Anything you would like to highlight by way of your background or personal context before we dive in further?
Well, that was really great. Yeah, my work has really specialized in valuing intangibles, particularly for organizations, but things that don't appear on the bottom line. Reputation, brand, corporate social responsibility, leadership quality, culture, and social impact, and then linking those to bottom line performance, because that's really how you help executives understand what they should care about and what's going to have the biggest bang for their buck.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that because we need more of that. I always talk about, for example, in social impact work or corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line, however you want to frame up the work of corporations, on when there's this more kind of human side or the environmental side or whatever, there's a case to be made. There's a human case to be made for all of these things that in and of itself, I think is valuable. But to your point, we need to be able to communicate it and articulate it in a way that also demonstrates the clear bottom line business case for these initiatives as well, because they're both there. It's not an either or. We really do have the opportunity to strongly influence the overall success of the organization while also tapping into the motivations of our people because we're taking care of them, we're involved in issues they care about, etc.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And when I've taught courses on this topic, it's always perplexing to students, for example, like in the area of sustainability. Why don't companies care about this? Why don't they just act in the best interests of the environment, for example? But they also have a fiduciary responsibility. So if we can tie those things together, and again, caring for employees in particular, and how that hits the bottom line, then people start to pay attention and make the differences they need to make.
Yeah. And in fact, when I think about kind of broader social impact work within organizations, kind of the arc over the last few decades, like overall, there's been huge, in my opinion, huge improvements, huge movement. Like there's been lots of positive developments within the for-profit sector in terms of trying to be more responsible. But I guess it begs the question, why? Because the benefits to the environment, the benefits to people have been there all along. So what's the difference? And I think the biggest difference, honestly, has been our ability to really make a clear, compelling business case for all of these issues that over time, more and more organizations see the value, they get on board, And while I would love for every organization, for every CEO, every leader to, quote unquote, do the right thing from my perspective, just because it's the right thing to do, I'm a pragmatist and I understand that, if they can get a win out of it, they're going to be far more likely to support something or promote something in more meaningful, healthy, and sustainable ways when they have that kind of bottom line impact, not just the warm fuzzies, so to speak, of impacting people in a positive way.
Right, that this is nice. And I'm dating myself here, but in the early 2000s, we used to still have arguments with CFOs, for example, of why intangibles mattered.
Yeah,
Because, and certainly unlike UK where they were doing triple bottom line reporting, we weren't doing anything. And
yeah,
then started to get it. And of course, in the dot-com era, we really started to notice that, where there were business plans, but they didn't necessarily link back to anything bottom line. People really started to notice that.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk more about measuring workforce sentiment. Because this is something you spend a lot of time and energy doing on a variety of topics. Tell us a little bit about your general approach, and then we can zoom in and talk a little bit more specifically.
Well, in particular at Aniline, one of the things that we're doing is scraping 27 different sources of employee sentiment data,
Hmm.
um, and bringing it together and combining it in a way that actually explains various categories of employee sentiment. And one of the things that I love about online data like this is that employees feel much freer to comment than they would on an in-house survey where
Yes.
they're promised anonymity, they're promised confidentiality, but they're not really sure. But if they get on some platform, some social platform, some of the more well-known ones, Glassdoor, Indeed, and some of the lesser ones as well, they're going to be a lot more likely to not only speak more openly, but they're going to speak about topics that might not have otherwise come up. And that's one of the things that I just love about this kind of data. It's open, it's clear, it's comprehensive, and we pull it together in a way that makes sense, in a way that you can combine these into comprehensive categories where you can define them and where you can help companies take action. So that's really been my focus more recently at Aniline.
That's wonderful. And to your point about anonymity, that's really, really important. Confidentiality and anonymity. And even when organizations do in-house surveys and they promise that that's the case, there's still, in many places, large scale distrust in that.
Exactly.
And in many cases for good reason, because there was an interesting study put out in Harvard Business Review a month or so ago about employee surveillance and the impact of employee surveillance on productivity and innovation. Spoiler alert, it's not good. Like when you're micromanaging and surveilling your employees, but lots of organizations do it and they do it pretty blatantly. And even, I was at an organization recently where they were doing just a climate, like an annual climate survey, an employee climate survey. And in the survey itself, it specifically talked about anonymity. But then in a side meeting I was having, someone admitted that they actually track all the IP addresses of where each survey comes from so that
Mhm.
they can tie it back to a particular person. And in their mind, that was a good thing because then they would know who they could follow up with if there were concerns. From my standpoint, I'm like, oh my gosh, you are just like violating a major contract with that employee where you said this is anonymous. So those types of behaviors, as well intentioned as it may have been in that case, I think they thought they were doing something that was reasonable. As well as intention as that person may have been for setting it up that way, those types of issues happen in organizations all the time. And so having third party outside places where this data can be gathered and then being able to pull that in together for meaningful analysis and insights is super valuable, and it helps us get past that the potential distrust that employees may have within their own institution.
Exactly. And oftentimes they'll bring up issues that they wouldn't have brought up at the organization when they're asking, particularly with a CAN survey.
Mhm.
People will bring up issues that they're having. And, one of our really interesting findings. I think we have 700 million data points, is about 52% of those comments are actually positive.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times, we hear, well, isn't all that just going to be negative? Negative commentary, isn't it all just people are disgruntled? And that's really not the case. I mean, 52% are positive. Most people will really try to be measured when they're on
Yeah.
a site like that, in part so that their critique will be taken seriously.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, and of course, human behavior is really influenced by biases and social dynamics that might not be specifically observable on a day-to-day basis, but in these kind of platforms, they really come through. And they can talk about all sorts of things: cultural misalignment, discrimination, favoritisms. Companies could really discover a lot about hidden biases that they have in the way that they're um, doing business that can allow them to make some easy changes before morale is impacted. And that's huge.
Yeah, that is huge. So, if you don't mind, could we dig into maybe one or two examples of some of the recent types of studies you've been engaged in as you're scraping the secondary data from various sources to then provide insights to organizations around their business impact and reputation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one particularly interesting example is data that we had scraped on several banks, including like Silicon Valley Bank, leading up to their failures.
Yeah.
Um, there were tons of risk indicators. Employees really knew the truth, but they didn't feel like they were being able to express that. It was a truth that sometimes the CEO didn't want to hear. We were able
Mhm.
to effectively predict these kind of things from seeing the warning signals that were leading up to that, leading up to those failures that could have potentially been prevented had employees be able to speak the truth. There's all sorts of trust issues that came into play, all sorts of fear that came into play, but again, all sorts of risk. Um, and that's a lot of what we do is identify risk. We identify culture, how culture drives performance, how culture drives risk, and we look at how to measure the elements of culture. But really, how do you break down culture in manageable ways so that employers really understand what they can do to make a big difference? So we really run the gamut in what we're looking at in terms. We'll also look at things like predicting engagement and turnover trends. Employee sat and engagement are really directly tied to perceptions of fair treatment, of growth opportunities, of meaningful work. And when these perceptions decline, turnover and tensions rise. And of course, in this time of massive layoffs and things like that, that's really going to be critical. One of our big findings recently has been sometimes and stop me if I'm going too far, but one of the things that
Sure.
I thought was really interesting was with regard to layoffs. Oftentimes, trust is eroded. Sometimes you'll see loyalty will actually increase, but the problem is that it doesn't translate into productivity. We find that
Mhm.
loyalty may increase because employees are afraid that they're going to be next, so they're scrambling, they're working extra hard, they're working extra hours, but it doesn't necessarily translate into increased productivity. The trick is really coming back and helping employees to re-engage, to build trust again. So a lot of what we do when we're looking at this data is looking at factors of, what would you need to do? What can you possibly do to increase trust in an organization where it's been eroded? How can you reassure employees that there's going to be some changes? And by looking through this employee data, you can start to get a sense of what it would take. It's not just about verbal reassurances, it's about actions, it's about cultural shifts, it's about making changes to make the company more successful. And all of these things that are identified through the sort of data that we um, we collect. It's really about anticipating and about addressing culture-related risk that can adversely affect performance and ultimately reputation, and helping companies get to a more healthy, more adaptable workplace that supports long-term success.
Yeah, so I overall I would kind of put it into a few buckets. Correct me, if I'm wrong or if this resonates with you. But we have all this stuff related to employee experience. Then we have all of this stuff related to organizational branding and employer branding for employees, but also for potential future employees who might choose to work with that organization. And then we have customer experience and all of the things that go into the customer experience bucket. And I think each of those, there's all these distinct sentiments in each of those buckets that really drive all sorts of important outcomes for organizations. Certainly, attracting and retaining good people uh, as employees and workers within the organization is of vital importance, but attracting and retaining customers and having good brand reputation and all of these things. And they start to build off of each other too. And because of the democratization of information, we have all these different places around the internet where people can share. It's not just people grumbling at the water cooler. It's like people posting all over the place about their experiences. And in many cases, it is negative. Sometimes it's positive. And being able to harness that and leverage that to make meaningful change within your organization is something I think any good leader would want to try to do. They often just don't know how to go about doing it, right? And so having organizations like yours that can help facilitate that is really, really key. Can you walk us through, without sharing any of your secret sauce, like walk us through some of the logistics, the process that you go through as you're trying to scrape and pull together this data and then make meaning out of it? Because something else I found is that in many organizations, they don't have a shortage of data. There's lots of data, but they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to analyze it, and they don't know how to make decisions based off of it. So, can you walk us through that a little bit?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And you're definitely at the crux of it. Most of my work has been, with organizations where they've got tons of data in disparate parts of their organizations that have no idea how to pull it together. And what we're doing is really pulling it together, scraping these different sources, 27 different sources of data, um, pulling it together, normalizing it, basically finding categories for fit. And when I work individually, I'm working on what's called a grounded theory method, which is basically to put ideas together that seem to hang together, but then later on attaching labels to describe them, so that you're starting with no preconceived notions of what something should look like, and then letting the model emerge, letting the themes emerge in and of themselves, and then attaching a label to describe them, so that we're coming up with ideas, and you're looking both for ideas that refute and also confirm, that this area. And then eventually what you have are very, very strong constructs, very strong and definable constructs that you can
Mm.
attach these labels to. Not only that, but you also have the definitions behind them. I talk about this constantly in companies. Like, you should never have to go back to do qualitative research to define what it was that you meant, initially. Because otherwise it's really meaningless. And what I love about this kind of data is it's coming purely from the voice of employees. So you can be using terms to describe it that also come from their voices. So you don't have to wonder what was meant. So you combine those, and then from there you can come up with these general themes. Now we have an aniline index, which actually is a score on how well they're doing in particular areas. And at this point, we can also then define for them what it was that we meant when we were talking about culture, what it is, what we're talking about where, leadership is not doing as well, or maybe, culture is higher, or trust or loyalty or things like that. What is meant by that? Exactly how is that defined? And also what kind of an impact would a change in those have on ROI factors, things like retention, things like loyalty, things like recommendation as a place to work. That's absolutely critical as well. So we're putting together these models in a way We use generative AI. We also use some very standard statistical techniques to pull this all together into very robust predictive models that can both help an organization understand what matters, but also how much different changes would link to bottom line performance.
Yeah, and that information allows us to make data informed decisions. In a complex world, complex environment with all sorts of noise and data coming at us all the time, I think most leaders want to make good, informed decisions. Oftentimes, they're doing the best they can within the context they find themselves in as they're being bombarded by different voices, different sources. Providing some clarity around that, providing some easy ways to understand and kind of pull out the different pieces of the noise into things that make sense. That's going to be really, really important to help organizational leaders, uh, not get caught in analysis paralysis, but actually put proactive steps in place to resolve. So if you have cultural misalignment, if you have disengagement and dissatisfaction around various topics or issues, if you have eroding trust, like it's the first step is to really understand this is a problem and what goes into that problem. The next step then is, what do you do about it? How do you actually make some changes that can implement and influence this in a more positive direction so that we can have better bottom line outcomes uh, for our people and for our teams, the organization, and people just generally will be happier, and they'll be more engaged, and they'll do better stuff for the organization and for the customers.
Right. And so often the changes that need to be made are not expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, they really have to do with shifts in attitude, shifts in the way that you communicate with your employees. And if you pull this data together in a way that really lets these concepts, these themes emerge, so you've got a robust definition, you can take action fairly easily, fairly quickly. I think a lot of times our customers, our clients are really surprised that how strategy will really jump off of the page at them. I've so many times been in boardroom meetings at various companies where I was consulting, where nobody's ever asked the opinions of the employees. They're just guessing. I heard
Yeah.
this, heard so and so this. We try to eliminate the biases that come from a one-off story. An outlier, for example. It's amazing to me how many strategies have been built on outlier data, where there's one really fantastical tale. It's fun to tell, it's interesting to hear, but it's really got no basis in reality for the rest of the organization. And this is where we're combining massive amounts of data to give you information. You could trust that. That's robust. The other is just kind of interesting, but it's not something you want to base company strategy around.
Either way, right? You talked about a positive example influencing strategy, but sometimes it's like the one-off negative examples that also disproportionately then influence policy, practice, procedure, the strategy of the organization, and that's equally as frankly dumb to do that. But why do we do that? Because we're human, because we take shortcuts, because we're bombarded by information, we're not sure how to do it differently. And so all of this creates an environment where we can have that baseline understanding. Because I do truly believe that the vast majority of leaders wake up in the morning wanting to do right by their people. They don't want to exploit and take advantage of people. They want people to be there, to be engaged, to be happy, to do good work, and they want to help facilitate that. They just don't know how to do it. In many cases, they're just kind of replicating what they've seen in leadership in the past, whether or not it was successful or effective or healthy. And so then you end up having the perpetuation of bad behaviors, regardless of intention. Like set intention aside. I don't even really care what the intention of the leader is, because I'm assuming that usually their intention's probably good, but the actions speak louder than words and louder than intention. And so I want to see positive development, positive movement, positive improvement over time. And I think that's what most employees want. And they don't expect perfection. I don't expect perfection, but I do want to see, I want to see my leaders listening. I want them paying attention. I want them to do the best they can to make data informed decisions in meaningful ways. And I think most do have the intention to do that. They just need the tools to be able to do that more effectively. And that's something you're helping with. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And leaders are people too. I mean, they
Yeah.
have personalities, they're extroverts, they're introverts, you know, and they're filtering everything through that lens. So, when they're reading data in an individual level, they're not necessarily making sense of it in a way that they can act on. So if you can bring it together for them with a comprehensive report, if you can let them know, this is the way to think about it, and here's a strategy you can use, then it really starts to have that aha moment. It really makes sense. I always tell clients, about 80% of what we get you, what we tell you, you'd say, oh yeah, that makes sense. I get
Yeah.
it. Kind of doing that extra 20% that really gives you that aha that links back to the ROI. That's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. I often say it's most of this stuff isn't rocket science, but it's also not easy. It's hard because it takes intentionality, it takes consistency, and regular attention towards these things over an extended period of time. And that's hard. The aha moments will come, but largely most of the types of stuff that your research finds is stuff that people are like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, we should do that. um,
Exactly.
and it's just a great having the data to really back it up, so that again we're not just making assumptions, or we're not just thinking, or we're not just following the latest trend or whatever, but we're actually doing things in a meaningful way. Well, Pam, this has just been a really great conversation. I note the time. I need to let you go here in just a minute. But before we wrap things up, I wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, your team, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Yeah, absolutely. For more information, you can go to the Aniline website at aniline io. And they can contact me at my email address, which is pam.cohen at aniline.io. We'd be happy to have further conversations with you. Any other information, it can also connect on LinkedIn as well. And I appreciate people getting the understanding that employee sentiment data really, really matters, and bringing it together in a way that's comprehensive and also gives, scores and impacts and links back to bottom line is really what's going to make a difference for organizations.
Yeah, well said. Pam, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Pam and her team can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and please join us again soon.